We have an opportunity to hear the first briefing and give feedback to the very generous people who have given of their time to serve on this committee. And I'll take a moment to acknowledge them. And we have Jim Bailey here, Councilwoman Maria Antonieta with us, Berriosaba, Noah Garcia, and Lourdes Castro Ramirez. So thank you all for all you've done. So I know that many of you all have served our city on a variety of levels, but I hope that this one would be the most meaningful and potentially the longest lasting. It could be really transformative for our city for the next 300 years. So thank you all very much for your service. And I know we've had some briefings all across the city. There was one just, I think, last weekend at Palo Alto that I heard was also very well attended. But it is the first opportunity for some of our colleagues to give input. So, and then we know that this is not final, you're still in the draft form, but at least the opportunity to hear from some of us, and we appreciate your work. So I'll let, Lourdes, are you the one that's gonna get started on the presentation? And thank you so much for all you do and for your commitment to this project. And all as volunteers, I think that's very important to acknowledge because it does take time out of your day jobs. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Lourdes Castro Ramirez, and I have the great honor of serving as the chair of the Mayor's Housing Policy Task Force. Thank you to the Comprehensive Plan Committee for the invitation to basically, as the Councilwoman shared, to provide an overview and an update on the Mayor's Housing Policy Task Force, our process, our preliminary policy themes, and quite frankly, this meeting is really important for all of us because this is an opportunity to hear directly from the Comprehensive Plan Committee that is focused on implementing SA Tomorrow and ensuring that the goals associated with SA Tomorrow are being carried out. And so in many ways, we see the work of the Mayor's Housing Policy Task Force as building on the great work of the SA Tomorrow plan and the work that you all do within the committee. As the Councilwoman shared, I'm joined today by my colleagues on the task force, Councilwoman Maria Antonieta Berriosabal, Jim Bailey, Noah Garcia, and missing from the meeting today, he sends his regards, he couldn't join us today, is Gene Dawson. So the five of us have been serving on the Mayor's Housing Policy Task Force since summer of 2017, and we're very committed to this process. As the Councilwoman mentioned, for us, this has been a very, we've given a lot of ourselves. But we also know that many people have given a lot of themselves to this process of shaping what the mayor calls a comprehensive housing policy that is both comprehensive in terms of addressing the highest policy recommendations, but that is also compassionate, that is also understanding and addressing the everyday needs of some of the households and families that often get left behind. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started with today's presentation. Let me make sure. So SA Tomorrow, as we all know, SA Tomorrow is basically the city's comprehensive plan. And it's the foundation that speaks to how the city will sustain and manage the city's overall growth. Building on SA Tomorrow, we all know that there was an effort in 2010 that was launched called SA 2020 that allowed for the community to be involved in this comprehensive process to shape the future of San Antonio. And I remember for SA 2020, I was working for the San Antonio Housing Authority, and as a planner myself, I was very excited with the fact that the city was coming together to map out its future, to identify a vision, to identify a set of goals, and really to identify the highest needs within our city. That SA Tomorrow plan is woven into SA Tomorrow, as we all know. And so the work of the Mayor's Housing Policy Task Force was not about starting from scratch. It was not about creating something new. It was really about understanding all of the efforts that have been developed in the past 10 to 15 years, and in some cases in the past 30 years, and to look at how our city can galvanize around making housing a priority. So what we will be doing through this process, and what we have been doing through this process, is to ensure that our recommendations are aligned to the SA Tomorrow plan, that they build on past efforts. Also that we advance a strategic roadmap or a framework identifying the highest housing policy priorities. And in addition to that, we've gone, I think, a step further. We also think it's really important that we develop an approach to implementation and some key action steps. As a urban planner, as a policy person, I love this work, but I also know as a person who has managed budgets and agencies that everything really relies on the execution of this. How are we going to implement, if we're going to make housing a priority and look at it comprehensively, we also need to have a very sound implementation strategy and approach to ensure that things get done. So the Mayor's Housing Policy Task Force will be looking at not only advancing a set of comprehensive policy priorities, but also advancing an implementation plan, a set of specific action steps, and some tools and best practices to guide the work. This graph is not new, council members, to most of you. This was a graph that was presented just a couple of weeks ago by Peter Zanoni, and I think subsequently by the Director of Neighborhood and Housing Services, Veronica Soto. But this is a graph that illustrates one of the key challenges and key problems impacting housing in our city. Housing costs are outpacing incomes. It is, if you look at a 20-year period, it's very clear from this graph. The top line is the housing price index. In about a 20-year period, the housing costs in our city have increased by about 50%. But then we look at the median household income, and we also see at the bottom line that incomes have not kept pace with the rising cost of housing. And so as a result, this issue is magnified at the neighborhood level, and it's magnified also at the family level. Families are having to spend more and more of their income towards housing, and that's clear from looking at another data set, which is important for us in understanding the pressures that families are feeling when it comes to housing. 165,000 households here in San Antonio are experiencing what we call cost burdens. What does that mean? That means that about a third of all households in our city are paying more than 30% of their income. And so when we look at housing affordability and the definition that we are using to define housing affordability, we are looking at housing affordability as housing that allows for families and households to not spend more than 30% of their income. When families are having to spend more than 30% of their income, they are having to choose between paying the rent and paying for food, or for transportation, or for healthcare. It begins to put pressure on the household. And this is not just a rental problem. This is not just impacting individuals that rent, but it's also impacting homeowners. 21% of all homeowners are paying more than 30% of their income towards housing, and 48% of all renters are impacted by this. So affordable housing for us is doing our best to ensure that all households are able to access quality, safe, decent housing without having to spend and sacrifice the basic necessities that families need, so without having to spend more than 30% of their income. So now I'm going to just walk you through where the task force has been in the last 9 months, and where we have been with the community in this process of developing the key comprehensive policy recommendations that will be presented to council next week. Early on in our process, we thought it was very important as a task force to develop a vision statement and a mission statement to guide our work. And this vision statement really has been guiding every step of this process for us. We have charted really our own process as we develop this comprehensive and compassionate housing policy. Our focus has been to be inclusive, to look at providing housing opportunity for all current and future residents, to ensure that residents have a meaningful say in the decisions that impact where they live, and also this idea that everyone should have a place to call home. If we start with that premise, then we're ensuring that we're thinking about every single segment of our city, from the individual that needs housing with services to the couple who is looking to buy their first home and is in need of homeownership counseling and support to navigate through the process. We also were very focused on really using housing as a platform for creating healthy neighborhoods, connected communities, and ultimately a shared prosperity, right? When we look at housing that is safe, affordable, and stable, we also think it's really important that it be delivered through a sustainable system. And this theme of sustainability and developing a system that is coordinated really has become a theme that has been identified and has been a common thread throughout the entire process, and you'll see a little more of this in the next few slides. Comprehensive. For us, comprehensive meant that it was not enough for the 5 of us to sit around the room and look at data and come up with policy statements. We developed what we consider a very much a bottoms-up approach, an inclusive approach, an approach that was informed by community, an approach and a process that was informed by data, and also a process that was informed by understanding how other cities across the country are tackling this problem, looking at other national best practices. And this pyramid just illustrates for all of us the various opportunities of engagement that were included in this process of developing a comprehensive housing policy plan. The other important piece for us was a commitment to real, meaningful community engagement. So we did our best to maximize outreach through numerous outlets, through numerous partners. This also illustrates the level of outreach. Some of this outreach was done individually by members of our task force. A lot of it was done in partnership with a number of organizations, and also with, of course, a number of people that are seated here with us in this meeting today. So we started our work about understanding the housing challenges and the housing problem in San Antonio by looking to inform ourselves about the problem, looking to educate ourselves about the data, and really a commitment to elevating the understanding of housing. And I'll share with you that I had a conversation with Molly Cox from SA 2020 early on in this process, and she shared with me that, you know, housing is a complex issue and theme to talk about. It's, you know, so basic. It's such a basic necessity. You know, it's when we think about where we live and the memories of our home, that's who we are and that's our identity. But we oftentimes dismiss it as not being a priority, right? Or do not give, you know, housing the level of focus or understanding of how families are challenged when it comes to housing. And so we determined early on that it was important for us to educate ourselves as a task force, but also to develop a process that would lead to educating the larger community about the challenges regarding housing. So we created public working meetings. We held 8 public working meetings. The first one was held in October of 2017. That particular meeting was led with a presentation and a discussion on housing and neighborhoods by looking at it from an equity lens. We had Christine Drennan, Dr. Christine Drennan, provide a presentation, and we opened up the conversation. We also held 7 other working group meetings. I know Councilman Trevino was able to join us for one of those meetings, and in fact, this picture that is on this slide was taken on the day of your visit. This is the Chief Appraiser, Michael Mesquita. We had an opportunity to have a conversation with him about the challenges and issues that families are facing as it relates to property taxes. So throughout, you know, this process, we listened to experts, to community members. We asked a number of questions on topics ranging from redlining to economic segregation, to the ad valorem tax appraisal process, and also to understanding the current state of the housing trust, of the San Antonio Housing Trust, and understanding the potential for it to be a tool to address the housing affordability in the future. We also developed a very intentional public input process. We coordinated 3 public meetings. The first meeting was held at Our Lady of the Lake in Council District 5, and we had the honor of having Councilwoman Gonzalez there with us. Our second meeting was at Sam Houston High School, and Councilman Shaw was able to join us for that. And as was mentioned earlier, our final meeting was held at the Palo Alto Community College, and Councilman Saldana was able to join us for that particular meeting. And these workshops were, again, an opportunity for us to hear directly from residents on their experiences, their perspective, their concerns, and also their solutions. I have mentioned that this process was data-driven, and data is not just quantitative data that comes from economic or market data, but data is also stories, experiences, voices, and concerns from residents. And so these public input meetings gave us the opportunity to be able to have basically rich conversations with residents on their perspective of housing, and more importantly, on their perspective of how to address the challenges that neighborhoods are faced with when it comes to housing. And of course, we didn't do this on our own. We started off, the 5 of us, mapping out this process, and we quickly realized that, of course, the staff support was instrumental in helping to guide this process. But we also thought that it was really important to be able to engage some national and local technical support. These 3 organizations are all national organizations that are working on housing affordability, and comprehensive community development work across the country. 2 of the 3 organizations, NALCAP, the National Association of Latino Community Asset Builders, and the LISC San Antonio, the Local Initiative Support Corporation. These two organizations have a local presence. They have offices here in San Antonio, and we were able to engage their expertise and technical assistance not only for the task force, but more specifically to provide facilitation and resource support to the 5 technical working groups that were created and launched in January of this year. Economic Planning Systems was engaged earlier this year to provide data analysis and support, and also they will be assisting us with finalizing the report, the policy recommendations, and looking at best practices across the country. So the technical working groups, so we went from 5 task force members to just over 100 members that were involved with these 5 technical working groups, which really are 5 housing policy areas that the task force identified in December of 2017. As we began looking at the challenges and the problems facing San Antonio as it relates to housing, we settled on understanding the opportunity to develop policies that would lead to creating, first, a transparent and coordinated housing system, looking at how to improve the coordination not only within the city, but also across the city with other housing providers. Second, we recognize that many of our neighborhoods are experiencing change, and we recognize that it's important to be able to identify and understand the tools that neighborhoods should have or be using to address some of the changes that are taking place. And this was everything from gentrification to displacement to the connectivity that needs to exist within the neighborhood. The third area of focus for us was recognizing that there's not enough federal funding or state funding to be able to solve the housing issue. And to be able to address it comprehensively, we thought it was important to look at opportunities for the private sector to be involved and engaged. And the private sector is both, developers, large scale and small scale, but also other private partners like employers that are here in San Antonio that are looking to be able to increase housing availability to their workers. The fourth area of focus was funding and financing, and really exploring not only how we're using our current funding streams to expand affordable housing supply, but also identifying new funding and new financing mechanisms to ensure that this issue of not having sufficient affordable housing was addressed not just with existing federal and state dollars, but also with other funding dedicated to solving for this problem. And then finally, I shared with you all that a guiding philosophy for the task force was this belief that our work was really about ensuring that there was housing opportunity for all. And what that also means is, recognizing that there are segments within our population that not only lack access to affordable housing, but in order for them to be able to be successful and stable in housing, there's a need to be able to provide wraparound services or case management services, or really to create what we call service-enriched housing. So understanding the need for special populations and understanding the best practice models to address housing and services was a critical priority for the task force. So over the course of about 4 months, the technical working groups met to dive into each of their policy area. And in May, mid-May, they actually in early May, they were basically they completed their work. We held a 2-day session with the co-chairs of each of the technical working groups, and they presented their highest level recommendations. Altogether, we received about 25 overarching policy recommendations. However, this chart represents all 300 recommendations, both policy recommendations and implementation strategies. And clearly, as you can see, the efforts to make the system more effective, the efforts to address creating a coordinated and transparent system were top of mind for many people. It was about 46% of all the recommendations. The second highest was addressing funding, the funding strategy, funding mechanisms, and quite frankly, looking at dedicating new funding sources to address the overall housing need. So where are we now? The task force has reviewed data from economic planning systems on trends within the city. We have reviewed all 300 recommendations, and we are now in the process of deliberating and finalizing our highest housing policy recommendations. And just quickly, these are the 5 overarching themes that have been identified that will guide the final policy recommendations. The first is around investing in what we call a housing ecosystem, building local capacity. And building capacity means building capacity and support for our city staff, and specifically for our city department, the Neighborhood and Housing Services Department, but also looking at ways to create a stronger ecosystem within the entire city by improving and increasing the coordination among the nonprofit housing providers and other housing developers. The second area of focus has been on, or the second theme is establishing dedicated sources of funds for housing preservation and new construction. Housing preservation for us is activities related to home rehab programs, repair, really looking to invest in the current stock of, in our current housing stock. That was also a very clear problem that was identified throughout the process, that we needed to do more to support existing homeowners to increase our current housing stock. And then new construction was both new construction of rental units and multifamily units. The third theme is looking to restructure city strategies for how we deploy housing funds, and also how that information becomes more accessible and more transparent. The fourth theme is protecting neighborhoods and identifying strategies and tools to mitigate displacement. And then finally, investing on improving the current regulatory environment. And that includes policy recommendations that also address some of the development challenges that small-scale developers and large-scale developers face when it comes to being able to produce affordable housing. So the 5 of us are reviewing the 9 months of work that has been generated through our public working meetings, through our public input sessions, through the data that has been provided by economic planning systems, but also through the data that has been shared by the city staff, through the, we're reviewing all of the recommendations and actually have completed the review of all of the recommendations from the technical working groups. And now our focus is on identifying the highest level housing priorities. And as we get to to doing that, we're of course grateful to have the opportunity to be before you, because this is an opportunity for us to hear directly from each of you as to what your highest housing priorities are. If there's something that was presented that you think is important for the task force to be able to follow up on or to provide more information. Our goal, again, is to be able to present the final policy recommendations to Council on June the 20th. And then in July, we will be issuing 2 reports. The first report will be a high-level executive report that includes the housing policies, the problem statements, the implementation strategy, the action steps, tools that the city may consider using, and also some best practices. And then by August of 2018, we will provide the final comprehensive report that will also include the documentation, the data generated through the technical working groups, and a number of other resource items. And we think that given the timing of the council's deliberation on the budget, this will be an opportunity for the council to be able to look at how we began to implement and how we began to make housing a priority. Again, this is not just about identifying housing policy recommendations, but truly it's about laying a blueprint for how we implement and how we implement and make housing a priority, specifically to address some of the key problem statements. And so with that, I will conclude the presentation and open it up for questions and a conversation with the committee. So thank you, Councilwoman.
Thank you so much. Such great information, and let me start with the citizens. We do have one citizen to be heard, Barbara Hewitt. Howell?
Right, it's Whit Howell, Whit-Howell.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I wanted to come here today because I've been attending probably 90% of all of the sessions, and it's just fabulous that we're focusing on this. I'm so glad. But one of the things that's happened is that seniors have been kind of left out of the picture, senior needs, the senior housing needs. And I wanted to bring some statistics to you and some of the history of what's been happening. 1 out of every 5 San Antonians are seniors over the age of 60. And the senior housing needs were subsumed under the Special Population Subcommittee. And the focus of that committee became residents with disabilities. An unfortunate development as far as we're concerned. There was one person representing senior housing needs, and that was the ARP representative who, out of the 20 folks that were on that subcommittee, and our technical working group, excuse me. And she wound up being a one of the co-chairs later on in the process. The unfortunate thing about it is that the statistics, actually their city statistics, is that only 17% of seniors are disabled. So for a lot of folks that went, especially to the last meeting, it's just a really unfortunate thing that people think everyone who's a senior is disabled, because that's not true. So I really believe that seniors lost their place on this subcommittee. The resolutions and recommendations by both the City-County Joint Commission on Elderly Affairs and ARP were not incorporated, even though they were presented. We got, unfortunately, spent a lot of money on copies that didn't get incorporated. I also wanted to bring this statistic to you. The average Social Security payment for seniors is $1,200 a month, which is brings you to being at 60% of the average median income in terms of housing need and availability of income for that. And so I believe that the senior housing needs need a more specific representation on the Housing Policy Task Force. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. I know I have quite a few questions, but I could start with my colleagues. Does anybody want to start? Councilman Trevino? Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Lourdes. Thank you to everyone being in the task force, Maria Berosabal, Noah, and Jim. Certainly we miss Jean as well. I also want to thank all the folks that have supported you in making sure that you guys had all the staff support needed. So I want to thank the staff that helped provide support for a lot of the meetings, Peter Zanoni and Veronica Soto. Of course, we also have the planning department here as well. And I want to thank all the citizens that are here, Barbara, Cynthia, Cosima, Anissa. We got a lot of great people here, Gemma. You can see that this is really a complex and very difficult issue because it does involve all the different layers and unique parts of our society. So I'll start with Barbara with Howell's comments about seniors. I think that it's a great point to make about seniors because much like the housing itself, it's sort of this symbiotic relationship between the health of a person and the health of housing and what that means to somebody, right? And how that the house has a real effect. And I think, Lourdes, that's the way you put it. It's part of our identity, but it's almost also part of our health and who we are. And so there's so many elements of a house that as we age in place and we age in the home, they really have an effect on our health. They have an effect on our psychology, and they really impact us in such a big way. And so therefore, as you expand outward into the neighborhood, it really is something that we should be looking at in terms of kind of the overall connectivity of our society and the health of our society and how it looks at itself. There's the identity I think you were talking about. And I think about one of the things that I hope, because I haven't seen all the recommendations yet, but I would hope that as we're looking at some of the recommendations, that we think about breaking them down into some short-term solutions as well as the long-term. And when I think about that, I want to point out that time, I think, is probably the biggest priority. What can we do with the time we do have, and how is time either an enemy or a friend? And I'll give you a perfect case is the roof program that we've started. The whole point of the roof program is to simply fix a roof. But we know that every day, a roof that's not fixed, it just further deteriorates, not just the roof, not just the structure, the sheetrock, or even the furniture, but someone's lives, right? I mean, this is, I think, what Barbara was talking about. And we've seen a lot of seniors just simply living with the condition of an unhealthy, not well-maintained home. And my hope is that we can look at and I know you're looking at the existing housing stock, but in terms of the short-term and the long-term effects, what we can do a lot of great things in the short term. We really can, that help to provide that long-term outlook. But in the meantime, we know that there's a lot of seniors simply living with substandard conditions. And whether that's just simply a leaky roof or holes that allow insects and rodents and you name it, it's unacceptable. And this begins to kind of tie into a lot of what you were saying, and I like first of all, I want to compliment the overarching themes, and I think that this is really this is really a great formula here. So I'm gonna give to you what I heard, and then you tell me if I'm on the right track. But again, when we're thinking about issues like the existing housing stock, because I think that's the immediate short term. We've got to save the housing stock we do have. And that translates to the existing neighborhoods that we have. I think about several things. I think about infrastructure, like sidewalks, like streets, street lights, proper drainage. There's neighborhoods that are affected by all these things, and some of those that don't have any of these things. And how do we as a city help to provide and improve that quality of life? Because I believe that these things are very much connected. They very much connect us to our neighbors. And I think connected neighbors allow us to shine a light, and much like your overarching themes, help us to create strategies so that we're understanding what we need to establish. How do we dedicate the support and the help? People just need to simply know that their neighbor's going through something. They may not know it, and we as a city need to know more about what are the exact issues happening with individuals in their homes and in their neighborhoods. And so I believe a more well-connected city, a strong push for basic infrastructure is going to help with that. Another one is intergovernmental. And you put up the slide of Chief Amezquita. And we came here and we presented about property valuations and what's happening. And of course, we can talk about why some property valuations are happening the way they are. But the thing that we have to pay attention to is where, right? And what we demonstrated that night was we demonstrated that there are areas where there's hotspots where the properties are spiking so tremendously, and the change is so great that that's hard to deal with, right? It's the change, the percentage change. And then there's areas where it's the opposite direction, where they're losing the value. And I got to tell you, we have to be equally concerned with those areas, because as we demonstrated, if there's an area that is seeing a huge spike, but another area that's seeing it the other way, you're about to have two different types of crises. One is that pushes people out because of affordability. The other one gives or leaves people with nothing. And this is what I'm concerned about, is that there's large swaths in our community where the values are really taking a steep dive. And how can we help to stabilize that? I think bringing it back to a more of a normalized condition is going to help both neighborhoods, those that spike up and those that are also losing the value. And that, I think, is critical. What we've also noticed is a lot of those areas that are losing value don't seem to have the infrastructure investment that we believe makes for healthy, well-connected neighborhoods. So that's just one aspect. That you have the Bear Appraisal District that I think can help us in many ways understand the pockets that are happening. But we got to look at others like CPS, our own entities, and SAWS, and what can we do more intentionally with fees and fee waivers, and what does that mean to development, and what does that mean to working together to prescribe something that is going to take all these things into account. One of the things I've learned in talking with CPS, SAWS, and the Bear Appraisal District is how much they don't talk. And there's affordability programs, and we try to sign people up for affordability programs for seniors, for example, but SAWS is manually doing that when the information is on file at the appraisal district. And so there's opportunity to connect a lot of these strategies that are already in place and maybe build on that. So it's my hope that we do more, or have a push for more intergovernmental support. I think the overarching point in your invest in efforts to improve the regulatory environment really speak to that. And then, of course, I would point out that how we look at our codes, how we look at our building codes overall, what that means. Are we allowing for innovative construction? Are we allowing for new building materials? How do we incentivize that? The issue I take with building codes is that they're typically reacting to something that's already been done. They're not necessarily promoting or creating setting the table for innovative building or design. And I think we can pursue a lot of that. We can allow some flexibility if we're chasing something meaningful like affordable housing. So I want to push for more of that. An example of that I would point out is the size lots that we have in certain areas. Just in my district, there are certain lots that because of regulatory ordinances that we have in place, it's difficult to put a house on it. But can't we be flexible? Can't we be flexible based on the mission that somebody is trying to take on? And so I hope that we can look at those kind of things when it comes to a regulatory environment, that we can take a more thoughtful approach depending on what the scope or the project is. And we can look at those regulatory codes that can actually encourage thoughtful developers and designers and builders to create something that I think would help in the situation, and maybe even something that we've never thought of. One of the issues that we have been facing, and we see it a lot in District 1, but we know it's an inner city issue. Not so much as the city grew out, but over time, when the city was laid out, and I'm glad the planning department is here, as we've laid out the different lots, there was all the history that the city went through. And as you mentioned, Dr. Drennan did a great presentation of some of the intentional and maybe some of the not so intentional things that have happened that we have to correct. So we're having to kind of go back and deal with a lot of legacy issues. And I'm seeing it. I see it in my district. I know we see it in all the inner city districts. Is the zoning, the planning in these areas do make a significant impact. It makes the issue more complex, and so you're not starting with a clean slate. You're starting with history and layers of issues that have been put on top, and I think Dr. Drennan did a fabulous job of illustrating that. But therein lies some opportunity if we say, let's be flexible. Let's find some way to be flexible instead of regulatory when it comes to building affordable housing in the inner city. Let's work with, not just review, right? And so, those are my basic thoughts on what I think you guys are chasing. And at the heart of that, we know that we as a city are also in a little bit of a quandary because we try to improve areas, and as the chief appraiser will tell you, we create value. And that value is a double-edged sword, because we want to create value, we want to improve the quality of life of people in their neighborhoods and in their areas, but we don't want to create value that pushes people out. And, I would lastly say, one of the things that we've seen too much of is that we invest in creating value in an area without us thinking about the calculus of who might be displaced, without thinking about if we're thinking about the overall cost of a project X, that we think is going to be an amazing, a good add to the quality of life and connect our city, can we not include in that calculus a way to respond to the housing need in that area and the potential displacement? It should be in the calculus from the get-go, just like land acquisition and building costs and you name it. It should be part of our calculus instead of us having to figure out after the fact, after we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars or investing into something, we know we can carve out. We know we can put it in that calculus. I think that calculus will help us also create that. One of the best questions is, should we be doing this? And I think it helps us as we're creating this, these improvements in our city, because we do want a more well-connected community. We want great sidewalks for people. We want great roads for people, good drainage projects. And there's no reason those things should be pushing people out of their homes. This is our responsibility as a city. So I hope I kind of captured a lot. I mean, it seems like your overarching themes are addressing that. Would you like to maybe say a few things?
Thank you, Councilman, for outlining your key sort of priorities. And in many ways, pretty much every single topic that you address has been either addressed through the task force or through our technical working groups. Two things that I would say. The first point on the focus on a long-term plan and also some short-term strategies. We're with you on that. This, problem of housing, rising housing costs, the cost burden on families. This didn't happen overnight. As we saw in the chart, it's 20 years in the making. And so we recognize that in order for us to begin to address the housing issue, we need to start now. But we also need to lay out a 10-year plan. And so what we are looking to recommend is a 10-year strategy or a 10-year implementation plan, with very specific short-term objectives that we hope you all will consider going into this budget year or into this budget discussion. Some of the strategies you articulated, and it is about investing in our current housing stock. We recognize that there needs to be more done to preserve and assist homeowners. But we also recognize that we need to do more to expand the supply of affordable housing. I think it's critically important that we have a long-range view, but also that we provide to all of you, for your consideration, some immediate action steps that can be taken to ensure that this problem doesn't continue to get worse.
Thank you, Lourdes. Just one last question. And it struck me in having a conversation with the chief appraiser, Michael Amezquita, that he says one of our issues with housing in San Antonio is that we only have a 3-month supply, and with regards to how the appraisal districts look at it, a healthy supply is closer to a 6-month supply of housing stock. Are we addressing that? I think what he's saying is it's the overall housing stock itself. And so the overall housing stock being so low is creating pressures where they don't necessarily have to be.
Right. It's a combination of increasing housing costs, really related also to the imbalance of housing supply to demand. And so there's also a data point that we can follow up with you and share that shows the growth in terms of population and jobs, but the number of housing units has basically not kept pace with that growth in population and jobs within our city. So that, hence, that creates additional pressure. And, I'm going to ask maybe Jim to chime in on this because we've done the analysis to take a look at the number of units that would need to be created over a 10-year period to address this problem.
There it is. Yeah, so we've done the analysis. I don't think we should get too far into the weeds at this point. I think we really need to look at all of this on paper, and we're still working through our final recommendations. The need is great. What we're showing is that there is a very deep untapped market in the sort of 80 to 150% AMI home ownership range. The problem is the market's not producing houses really at that price. And so if we can find a way to get some more housing built at that price, the market's virtually unlimited. What we've also discovered is that, much as we might assume, is that there is there's a shortage of some 32,000 rental housing units for families that are making below 30% AMI. There's a shortage of another 3,000 or 4,000 units for families making between 30 and 60% AMI. And those are some pretty big numbers, and they're pretty stark. So without revealing kind of specific recommendations, I think our thought is at this point, in order to stabilize the housing market in San Antonio and effectively sort of keep things from getting worse just in terms of number of units, we've got to target something like 20,000 affordable housing units over the next 10 years.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for your hard work on this, and we know there's lots more to do, and I look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Courage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that we need to start at a point where we understand that there's really is a crisis in housing in San Antonio. We talk about affordable housing being needing 150,000 units to really accommodate the population. I don't know if your research has verified that that's a fairly accurate number, but that's what we've heard a lot of, that we could use 150,000 units that would be livable, that would be sustainable. Of course, we have people living in housing units today that are certainly substandard, and we want to improve their quality of life in those homes. So if we're talking about 150,000 units, it seems to me that that's something we just simply can't build our way out of, even in 10 years or 20 years. So it really has to be a combination of new single-family homes, which are really the most expensive and probably get developed in the least numbers compared to then multifamily. We need to have more multifamily apartment complexes that people can feel proud of living in. But also, I think we need to renovate or rehab probably 50,000 homes in this city where people are living today, that if we could help rehab that home with a new roof, new electricity, stabilize the foundation, some paint, good sidewalks outside, people who are living in those homes would love to live in those homes another 20 years. And so I think that's the overall target I would like to see us come back with, is how are we going to meet those kinds of needs? How many new homes do we want to build every year? How many multifamily apartment units do we want to build? How many rehab homes do we want to build to achieve the idea of getting everybody in a safe and affordable home? But also, I think we need to look at what are the development barriers that need to be removed in order to do that? Or on the other hand, what are the incentives that could be put into place to do that? Because certainly there's both. It may be new home development. There's a lot of builders who say there are barriers to doing that. There are certainly barriers to rehabilitating homes as well. One of the problems I see is that when the city looks at any kind of rehabilitation, they want everything brought up to today's high standards for codes and building quality and everything. People are living in homes today that weren't built that way. And a lot of those homes are still very livable. Maybe they need a roof, maybe they need electricity, but to say that the city or the community can afford to invest $80,000 or $100,000 in all of those homes that might be worth $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 is so impractical. But we say we have to do that because we've got to build to today's standards and today's building codes. And I'm wondering if we can't find a median position where we can establish some rehabilitation codes that provide safe housing, healthy housing, without having to meet those codes that we've put in place for new housing today. I realize that's probably a very questionable thing to consider, but if we can reduce the financial burden on rehabilitating homes where people can continue to live another 20 years and be happy and healthy in there, then that's a lot more affordable and a lot more achievable than rehabbing all these homes up to the modern standards that we demand. So, those are barriers or incentives I think we need to look at. Another thing is when we look at developing new homes, and particularly I would say multifamily homes, if it's getting a subsidy from the city, then I'd like to see us not coming out with properties that have 50% market rate and 50%, 80% AMI. Those are way too expensive for probably 30, 40% of the people who live in a city. We need to have lower AMIs. We need to have 60% housing. You were even talking about how there are 30,000 people living in an economic situation between 30 and 60,000 AMI or percent that need housing. And so if we're going to be incentivizing development of multifamily housing and even, single-family housing, I think we need to be able to create the kind of housing that people who are earning $35,000, $40,000, $45,000 a year can afford to move into, whether it's apartments or housing. And I know those are challenges, but I'm wondering if we can find a way to develop the financial wherewithal, the opportunity to provide tax incentives somehow to create that kind of affordable housing instead of everything at 80% and maybe 10% at 60, 5% at 30, and 75% at market. I agree. We've got plenty of market people who want to buy homes or live in nice apartments and pay $1,700, $1,800 a month, but we need to accommodate those $450, the $750, the $900 a month families too. So I'd like to see some of that in the plans that come out. Also, I think that's going to take the city maybe having to expand our authority in our own charter to be able to do some of this. And I don't know if you're going to be coming forward with a recommendation for a charter revision so that the city can be a greater player financially in the development of housing. But right now, we're very limited, very structured in what we can do. And it is a city problem. So, I'd like to see us look at that. I think we need to find more financial and funding resources. Another concern is when we talk about providing resources that are out there today, we need to better educate buyers and tenants on what those resources are out there to assist them. As something as simple as rehab money that we have available, or the city will help pay for the repair of a sidewalk, or there are so many different projects, little pieces, bits and pieces, and it's CPS Energy coming in and helping the house become energy efficient. I don't think people know enough about that, particularly people who are struggling, just to make ends meet. They haven't been able to invest the time to understand all of those opportunities, and we need to help provide them with that information so that they can maintain where they are and make it more affordable for them. Another concern I have is tenants' rights. And I think you alluded to that, Councilman, when you talked about the great development that went on in San Pedro Creek, but there are literally hundreds of families being moved out because of that development. So they're never going to enjoy it. but other people who are willing to pay twice the price for the rent will. We need to think about the unintended consequences of the development that the city and the county share and promote, and how it affects the affordability of housing for people who live in those areas. Can they continue to enjoy the improvements that are being made, or are they going to be forced out? So what kind of tenant rights, what kind of displacement obligations even can we put on developers, property owners, if they're going to do that? Should they share some of the responsibility, because they're going to share the gain when they bring new, higher-paying people in? I think that another thing I want us to think about is the steps to maintain livable neighborhoods. And a lot of that is going to have to do with some of the zoning that we're going to come out with. We're looking at our citywide plan, what kind of zoning changes, how will that affect the existing plans that are in place today? How can we protect the quality of the neighborhoods that exist? I have a big problem with the development of short-term rentals and what they're going to mean to the quality of life in neighborhoods if the city doesn't have some serious limitations on that. And I already have people coming to me in my area, in the north side, saying, we've got people buying houses, they're turning them into short-term rentals. And they're having big parties, they're having all kinds of things go on in the neighborhood that the neighbors have never been used to and didn't move into that residential area to have happen around them. And so that's protecting the quality of life in those areas that I think we need to work more on. That should be part of what you come out with your recommendations. Another thing is, I think that we should be looking at reclassifying what we call affordable housing and workforce housing. Because we're looking at workforce housing at 80% of AMI or higher. And we're looking at affordable housing at 30% up to 80% or something like that, or 60. And what that means is, when people in many communities around the city hear, oh, we're going to have affordable housing in our area, they're thinking, uh-oh, it's going to be a bunch of poor people who don't know how to take care of their properties moving into my neighborhood, into a new apartment or something like that. And the word affordable, I think, is being mischaracterized. But every one of those zones of qualification include people who are working for a living. And so all of that really is workforce housing. Maybe some people are only earning $30,000, but they're working. So it is workforce housing. That's what we should be emphasizing to the public, so that they get over that misperception that it's going to be detrimental to their neighborhoods. I've been out and looked at several great properties that were developed that are workforce housing complexes, like Prospera and Mike Hogan. And some of these builders are building quality that anybody would love to live in, but because it may be labeled as workforce housing, communities say, we don't even want it in our neighborhood. So, I think that we need to look at calling it workforce instead of affordable, and promoting it more in many areas of town. So I think those are some of the feedback, some of the deliverables I'd like to see come from the committee that would get us on a track with very specific things that we should be working on and accomplishing every year for the next 10 years if we're going to meet this need.
Yes. Thank you. I just wanted to mention, thank you so much, Councilman, for the detailed list. And these are important issues for us also, and it's very important for us to be as specific as possible. And so I appreciate your basically having you go through every sort of aspect of this comprehensive plan. I do want to just sort of draw the attention to a point that you made about workforce housing. And this is the first, I think this is really the first time we've had this level of conversation about redefining affordable housing and understanding that we have many, many families that are working poor, that are within the 30% AMI or 30 to 60% of AMI. And so I think what you have shared with us is something that we will consider very thoughtfully, because there is there is a misunderstanding, and quite frankly, I think that there is not enough information about what housing that is affordable really is. And, automatically, I think individuals go into a certain negative perception about who's going to live in that housing. So having us rethink the definition and how we describe that will be critically important. And I also, want to acknowledge that, Councilman, that we were very, very thankful that you were at every single community public input meeting, and you were there to listen, to participate, and also, now to, of course, offer your perspective. And so we very much appreciate your commitment to this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilman Courage. Councilman Saldana?
Thank you, Chair. And if, I've been attending committee meetings for a few years, and if the barometer of the interest and importance of the issue is how many questions and comments council members have, then this is a good indication of a really important topic, because I've gone to committee meetings where there's no questions asked from committee members. In this case, we've got two detailed lists, monologues of work, because we care so much about this issue. And it's true that I think Councilman Courage and Councilman Trevino have been following this at every step, and each one of them has a different sort of flavor to their recommendations and their pieces. For me, I just want to have a quick dialogue, because I know how important it is that you all, to really call out the amount of work and effort that you all have put into this. And I've been part of a lot of strategic designs and retreats and work sessions that lead to a final document. Or I think the closest thing I can get to that piece, the final themes, is your overarching themes on slide 13. And I think as I'm looking at each one of the 5, I got a really good sense of the bottom 4. The first, I'd like to get in your heads a little bit to understand how it is that you are. I'm just trying to understand the first bullet. I understand the last 4, but I'd love to know the workings and the conversations that you all had internally to get to the first recommendation of an overarching theme, which is to invest in improving the housing ecosystem, capacity, and accountability. Those are 3 big themes, or three big ideas. Can you just help me understand them, how you got to them, what you're driving towards in recommending that? Because I know that when you're doing these things, every word seems to matter when you're saying, look, these are the overarching themes we're going to put out to the community, to the committee, to the council, to the policymakers, to the writers who are going to be digging into that. So tell me about what you all were thinking when you came up with the first one.
Certainly, Councilman. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Councilwoman Maria Antonieta Berriozabal, to maybe lead the conversation in terms of what led to this focus on developing a coordinated housing system, and really beyond developing a coordinated housing system, it's really an ecosystem that starts within the city but carries out within the city staff, within the city government, but it carries out, to the rest of our city through the participation and the coordination and the focus on metrics and how we're spending our dollars across the board, from the Housing Authority to the Housing Trust to the nonprofit housing providers to also the private, developers. And so I'm going to maybe ask Maria to just give us a summary of how we got to this place, and then we can give you a little more sort of detail in terms of the vision.
Got it.
A summary indeed, which will be very difficult for me because I started looking at this from a history of 30 years. And to see what we were doing 30 years ago, where housing was not even in the radar, and that there are community people who have been wanting us to do something for that long. But I did it starts with implementation, and that it doesn't matter how many studies and reports we create, that if there is not an implementation process, it will not be done. And I did extensive research. I went back to 1997, where the city created a master plan. There was another plan, and I have a list that I'll be happy to share with you. There was another one done in 2009. It was a strategic plan. Then there was SA 2020, then there was SA Tomorrow, and I have a list of 10 that have been done. So I went in to see all the recommendations. There's some recommendations that have been repeated over and over, and they haven't been implemented. So what we decided is we need to make sure that a major part of our report is going to be how do we do this? Because I don't think our constituents, your constituents, want, 5-10 years from now to come along, Councilwoman, and what was recommended is not done. So what it is to making sure that the city has the capacity and the resources to implement what is being decided. Just a little piece of information here. Some of what you all discussed today, what the working groups came to us with, have already been recommended. I carry with me the 17 recommendations of SA Tomorrow on housing. The displacement issues that you brought up, there are 3 that have to do with that. One of them is to create a relocation plan. There are 2 others. So whose responsibility was it to do that? So that's part of our city's ecosystem. And to have capacity high enough in the management plan that they can oversee what you have brought up, planning, neighborhood housing services, human services. Housing is across the board, and there needs to be a high enough official in the city. Our task member who's not here, Jean Dawson, has reminded us over and over that housing needs to be infrastructure. It's the 4th leg of a stool. That is housing, energy, transportation, and water. So if we raise housing to the level of infrastructure, we will have corresponding management capacity and funding so that our report is not going to be another one that I can go back and do research and said it wasn't done. The level of management has to be at a level where they also are able to work with the county and with VIA and with the housing authority and with developers. So that's what the ecosystem is. It's a system that raises housing to a very high level. And in your vote during the goal setting session, when you added housing to your list of priorities, you have already done it. And we really want to thank you for doing that, because that was a historic decision that had never been made. You all already made housing a priority. So now we have to recommend something that we feel will make it possible for us to have that system that is not only internal but external. And that this time you all will pass something that will be there for 10, 15, 20 years. I think you mentioned 300. And I like that. I like that.
The one last thing that I would just add that is part of this ecosystem is also ensuring that we are providing resources and services in a coordinated way to residents, to individuals that are looking for housing opportunities, to individuals that are looking to buy their first home, but they don't know how to start the process. One of the technical working groups described the interest in creating a housing one-stop center. And so the coordination means, coordinating how we do the work, how we innovate, how we implement and deploy our dollars, but it also means how we provide information and make information more accessible and available to individuals that are struggling with housing. So that's part of the ecosystem as well.
Lourdes and Maria, thank you for making this, helping make this particular bullet point make sense to me. What you've said, here's what I take from it, is that I think I find myself often repeating this same line, which is that if it's not measured, then it doesn't get done. And what I would take from this is that I would hope that this council, that your recommendations reflect that if our city manager does not have a line item on her metrics for success when we provide a great assessment of her job that deals with housing and the recommendations that come from this task force, then we may have failed. Because if it is not driven from the top level of administration, to your point, accountability and capacity, if it's not driven from that top level, it may get lost. If Peter Zanoni, who oversees this, but also has a branch of 12 other folks who have a toe in this piece, if Peter Zanoni's job is not dependent on his ability to drive the outcomes in this, then he may not worry about it as much, and the accountability may not exist. So it may just end up being another presentation or great task force or great set of recommendations until it's driven by some accountability. And I think that's direction to us here, and I hope you'll reflect it, because I'm ready to say that there should be an indictment on the city that has seen so many recommendations go unfulfilled because there hasn't been somebody to really take hold of them and through the thread of capacity. City manager in my mind makes a lot of sense because we've gone through I've gone through close to 8 years on the council, and we've changed mayors, we've changed council members, but if the mainstay force is a city manager who cares about this issue because it's part of her matrix and assessment, and bonuses are tied to it, and compensation is tied to it, then I think it gets done. So I think that's what you're driving at here, and I think what that direction to the city manager is that we need to consolidate this in a place where we can measure it. We need to consolidate this so that anybody who deals with issues of displacement, issues of code issues, issues of regulation around housing is in one place that we can actually manage an outcome. So that helps me a tremendous deal in understanding what you mean by improving the housing ecosystem, capacity, and accountability. And I almost see a cascade effect for the rest of the four, which is that part of it is you want to establish some housing sources of funds for housing and preservation, restructuring of current funds, protecting neighborhoods and mitigating displacement, which I think is going to require some of the funds from the top two. And then, of course, somebody who has to really dig into providing recommendations for the regulatory environment. I believe that's what we'll see in your final recommendations that come out from folks who live this every single day, who deal with the code rules that are written. And so thank you for helping me understand the overarching theme. And I think what the most important overarching theme is that one at the top. Because you're right, it can get lost if this is not seen as important as transportation, if it's not seen as important as our water or utility, or passing a bond every few years and implementing that bond. Because you can consider that the comparable is how we build the infrastructure for our bond every single year. It takes us 4 years. And when we measure whether we are doing right by the community who voted on them, we have a website that tracks the progress of every single project, every dollar spent. There's a lot of capacity and accountability built into that system. I wonder if we could do the same. And it starts with the importance of this council making sure that we're putting a foot down and saying it's important to us, but also relaying that message to our management and our staff. To make sure that we are doing this in a way that can drive outcomes that we can point to, that are measurable, that we make sure this isn't a presentation or a set of recommendations that collects dust. So I didn't think we were going to be able to explain it in that way, but I appreciate you helping me get there in understanding that. The last thing I will say is just to echo what Councilman Courage said around this issue of, I think he's called it tenants' rights. I've heard it as renters' rights. We know that one of the biggest issues that we saw are the capacity we have. I think it was presented during our goal setting. I'm going to look in the direction of Vero, but I remember in my mind thinking, oh my gosh, the problem really, if you looked at the whole, 3/4 or 2/3 is around renters. What was the line that we? Can you chime in and remind me again, Peter or Vero?
Let me see in this presentation here.
I think Vero's ready to go.
48% of renters are cost burden today. 48% of renters, 21% of
Gotcha.
homeowners are cost burden.
Yeah, you all have it as well. You all are singing the same song. And so when I think about what we need to do in terms of seeing in your recommendations around what renters' rights exist, what displacement obligations is, I think the way Councilman Courage put it, because what I would like to see from you all are very bold recommendations. I don't want to, create a fog. I want you all to be very direct with us and ask us to do things maybe we've never done before, because I think that's the level of commitment we need to have an effect on what we believe is going to be a crisis. So please don't be afraid to offer recommendations around significant code changes, significant improvements to our regulatory environment, or even significant investments around creating a source of funds that may include a charter change so that we can pass something like a housing bond, that may include some of a general fund set aside for displacement, or an understanding of how we create assets, whether that be general fund or assets in removing regulations. Please don't be afraid to present some very bold ideas to us so that we might be able to take action on them. That's the last piece that I've got. Thank you for your work. The reason we're here today is because we know that the free market on its own is not going to take care of the most vulnerable. And you all have told us exactly who the most vulnerable are. And in many cases, you could probably tell us a zip code or census tracts. And that doesn't come together without a lot of significant work and study. So thank you to Noah, Jim, to Maria, to Lourdes for getting us this far, and Jean. We really appreciate you all doing a lot of the tough work and us just getting to do the I would say equally tough work of deciding, implementing, and holding accountable on our end. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilman.
Thank you, Councilman. And I also just want to reiterate my concerns that the councilman suggested about having this, giving the staff the direction to include housing as part of their infrastructure plan or part of our whole development. I think we have not ever done that before. And, even Veto's sitting over there with 10 vacancies in her department. And I think it's also because we haven't prioritized housing in the city. I don't know what other vacancies look like, so maybe that's not a fair comment, but I would be very surprised if they have equal vacancies in every city department. So I think as we're going through and making these priorities, I think that's going to be very important. And making it part of the city manager's initiative is to make sure that we include housing. So I do have some questions that are a little bit more basic, and then I will give you all some updates that we have in our pilot program that's going on in District 5 related to housing. But just even regarding the community outreach piece, I was really impressed with all the people that came, and I want to ask about how that went about, if you had if it was mostly the same people over and over again. I know that you had technical groups, but then you had community groups. And so could you give us, I don't know who could give me feedback on why you think the outreach was most successful this time?
Yeah, I think that it was, thank you, Councilwoman, for the question. With regard to outreach, we were very intentional. We wanted to ensure that residents from all over the city had maximum opportunity to participate. We also, with the help of the city staff, set up a website to provide information, to make information available in terms of the presentations, but also in terms of meeting notices. At our last meeting at Palo Alto Community College, we had the opportunity of using a voting device to get a little more sort of information from the attendees. And one of the questions that we asked was around whether this was the first time that someone had attended a housing meeting. And 30% of the attendees at that community input meeting, it was their first meeting. And for us, that was really important because people are still engaged. The other extreme was about 60% had been to all three community public meetings. So we had, the consistency and the commitment from a number of residents, but also the ongoing interest, especially because we moved these meetings, to different parts of the city. So I think that our approach, again, to community engagement was very non-traditional. It was very bottoms up. We ensured that everything was in both English and Spanish. We also worked with the city staff to have interpretation services available. And to the extent possible, we tried to also provide opportunities to video stream or create videos to make that available.
Were you able to have those videos streamed or so we could download and hear them at another date?
We have some of our public working meetings were recorded early on. The last meeting, we had someone in the audience who recorded the meeting. he was a resident participant who recorded the overall meeting and posted it on social media. So we have a number of recordings, and those are available on the website.
Okay, well, hopefully we can get better at that. You know, it was brought to my attention, and I thought it really important when I saw the mother walk in with the children, and I thought how hard that was for her to,
Right.
imagine how hard it was for her to get here, and then having to leave because the children were, you did have childcare at community? Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Wonderful. Well, you know, maybe we consider that in our other meetings as well. We see how we make that happen so that we can have more community participation, because I imagine she would have liked to stay, but I know the feeling of going through a lot of trouble to get somewhere and then just having to leave because
Right.
we don't get cooperation.
Yes.
I want to add just a little bit of it. We showed you the circle of the individuals that were invited, and I would like to, you know, thank some people, young people, who took time to leaflet in the neighborhoods. They actually took our flyers and they leafleted. I don't know how many people showed up as a result of that, but that's including them in the process. And the other one is inviting organizations that are not on any of the city's lists. Veronica used all the lists that she has. We used SA 2020. We use Facebook. The mayor's office did social media. But we also, and I want to thank Noah Garcia, because he sent notices to the chambers. And we did have individuals show up from the chambers. And the other one is these small community groups that are in no one's list, but they're very active in the communities, and they really reach out to the grassroots. And what we'd like for the city to use this process in implementing the plan. There will be opportunities where the public is going to have to finish out our recommendations. And we suggest that this process be used so that it will really be broad, and that we can reach out to people that don't normally participate in their city.
Well, thank you, and I would agree with you. I thought it was really fantastic participation, and I know that, you know, as we're trying to touch different segments of the population for a variety of things, you know, getting people where they are is most important. And I'm very sympathetic to young mothers because, well, I'm not young, I should say mothers of young children, because it's very hard to participate even after hours, because then but you had the babysitting, so that's great. Another question that I had a little bit more, about just sort of the process that you all used. One of the questions, or I mean, again, you mentioned that you hope to have a working document that would be useful for 10 years. Why did you come up with 10 years?
Well, it is a very sort of common practice when you look at housing plans to look at it from a 10-year perspective. We also talked about the importance of building capacity, and you know, as we look at building capacity, we thought, you know, starting off with understanding in the first 3 years what are the necessary steps that need to be put in place to be able to you know, to carry us, you know, up to through the 10-year period. You know, I think we basically think it's also important to come up with a plan that's realistic. Councilman Courage mentioned this number of 150,000 units. When we started this effort, you'll recall that the 2013 comprehensive housing needs assessment indicated that there was a need of 150,000 units. And when we started to drill down and take a look at, you know, that number, we realized that that number was a combination of households that are spending more than 30% of their income or cost burden, units or housing that is substandard, that needs, you know, to be rehabilitated, and then just not having adequate supply of housing. And so there was some duplication in those numbers. And, you know, thinking about a number as big as 150,000 can be overwhelming for a community, especially a community that maybe has not been very intentional about making housing a priority. So we felt that it was important to come up with a realistic plan that was grounded on very sort of logical, methodical steps to build capacity and, you know, to get us to producing units as mentioned by the councilman, units that are not just rental units, but also looking at homeownership or single-family homes, and also looking at investing in the current housing stock, or looking at renovation and rehabilitation of housing.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. Let me give you some information about the pilot program. So we have a pilot program for, I know you all are very familiar with it, but we have a pilot program running in District 5 regarding housing, and it was, it came because so many of my constituents said primarily what they said they needed help with was owner-occupied rehab. But we had our first housing program, and we do have a housing center running out of MAC, the Mexican American Unity Council. It's open today for residents of District 5 to deal with many of the issues. But I'm going to read for you all the list of what was the priorities when people came to the housing program. The number one item, and I'm reading them here: estate planning and title issues preventing rehab loans, transfer to offspring, or selling, thus stifling investment and updating older housing stock. The second one was lack of lending products that permit buying and remodeling in one mortgage, preventing young families from moving from renters to ownership in the neighborhood. Financial counseling to guide renters and owners. The need for local contractors that are certified and dedicated to work in areas to prevent scams. Support for property owners and small-scale developers to build single-family and multifamily units. Reduce permit zoning and other barriers that increase price of small development. So this was targeted at District 5, but they were residents from 47 of the city's 82 zip codes that attended that fair. So, and part of that housing pilot was funded with our general fund dollars, about $50,000. A total of about $75,000 of city funds, and then we got about another $100,000 from the private sector to contribute. And so I guess one of my questions, Noah, I think is to you, and I mean, I understand that we're still in the pilot phase, but what is the private sector doing to help? I mean, we know that we need to start at the city to create policies that will enable, but it really has to come from the private sector. Is there, and I'm grateful, I know that we have several private sector members as well. What is the feeling?
And I really think from the private sector side, that the difficulty is the cost to produce housing. And with the barriers that are there, there's no market that is being developed because of land cost, because of development cost, and housing cost. So there is a, and if you're talking about private sector from the development side, or is it more from the private sector of businesses?
Well, no,
looking-
I'm mostly thinking about access to mortgages and the development sector. And I'm going to preface this with a little bit of information also there was a study that was commissioned by the Housing Commission, I think not this task force, but the Housing Commission, that showed that it was more expensive to develop in the urban area, but actually was a benefit to the city within the first year of development, and that any development, residential development outside of 410 was actually negative to the city for residential housing. So can you elaborate? I'm sure you're familiar with the city.
And I'm going to defer to Jim. He is really the expert in that area and really the
And
one
so-
that's
and then my
continued in the
question-
Housing Commission, but let him answer that
Okay,
question.
thank you. I sort of two-part then, like the private sector in terms of offering more availability for mortgages and different options.
So let me address the first part of your point. The first part of your point, and then turn it over to Lourdes to address, I think what the private sector is doing or is capable of in terms of finance. She and I have had a couple of meetings about this, and I know has been engaged in some of this too. Regarding your question about, I think what you're referring to is the Fregonese and Associates study.
That's correct.
That looks at the fiscal impact of various development patterns.
And I'm sorry, just to interrupt, is that study available to the public?
It's
Or perhaps we
available.
can get it
Yeah.
somewhere? Maybe it's already online, but if it's not,
Yeah. So it addressed some concepts that we've started to see float up over the last 10 years or so. And it's important, but I think it was the big takeaway for all of us in the Housing Commission is that, yes, it's cheaper to provide city services to folks who are living tied in. You know, they need fewer cars. You know, public transportation systems work. But the big takeaway is that the poorest San Antonians fundamentally can't afford an auto-dependent lifestyle, right? You know, a family that's making below 30% AMI, and I use this example a lot. Alamo Community Group runs a project in the Calcasieu building, and they have, I think it's something like 63 units, and of those units, the occupants own a total of 7 cars. Right, so it's affordable housing, and they're not spending what San Antonians spend, which is an average of 23% of their income every year on transportation. So we thought it was useful in that regard. Regarding you know, sort of the concept of affecting change on larger development patterns, I think we felt like that was a little outside the scope of our work. But we chose instead to focus in on the things that we thought directly contributed to the housing problem. And then
okay.
was that an answer?
Yeah,
The
it
answer you
is,
were looking for to that
it is-
question?
Yes, yes, and I thank you for that. Although I would, then if it is outside of your scope of work, then whose work is it? Because I think that's really important, because we know that within the CRAG actually is the best impact for the city. It is the most benefit. So, you know, so if it's not, it's not you, then I think it needs to be addressed in some way. And so is that, as us as policymakers, how we can continue to do that, because historically, as you all know, that the CRAG historically has not been invested in from an infrastructure perspective. So we're just starting to make some ground in that regard. So as we continue to make policy decisions, you know, how can we continue along that path? And perhaps it goes back to what Councilman Saldani was saying about making sure that the city is responsible for presenting that information. So I'll let you pass it over.
Sure, and I will just say that we're making our recommendations entirely cognizant of the goals of SA Tomorrow and the VIA 2040 long-range plan as we talk about affordable housing.
As it passes by me, I'll just say that it's an issue of coordination and priority.
So just building on what my colleague Jim and Noah mentioned, first of all, let me also recognize that the work that you're doing, Councilwoman, in District 5 is critically important, and we're looking at your model, the housing, the Comprehensive Housing Center, as a model for how we think about developing a one-stop housing center. We know that you're in the very preliminary stages and still gathering information in terms of impact. But within the report, we think it's important to point to some of the programs that have been either initiated by a council member or that are in place, that are working, but need some additional support or infusion of dollars. So I just wanted to acknowledge and recognize the great work of MOC and all of the other partners that have been part of this effort. And then secondly, I would say that in terms of the role of the private sector, and I think the best example of this is the Center City Housing Incentives Program, right? It was designed as an economic development program to create more housing in downtown. And it was a very predictable system with incentives, and developers like that. They like predictability, and they like also opportunities, to be able to reduce their risk. And from our perspective, Councilwoman, we think it's important for us to develop a system very similar to that for affordable housing. The city has the experience and the capacity within development services. There's a one-stop approach. There's great capacity. There's great capacity within the Center City Housing Investment Program. And as we look at finalizing our recommendations, we're looking at the models that are already in place in the city and looking at their applicability to affordable housing. Is it possible for us to be able to come up with an approach that allows for small-scale developers or large-scale developers to come to one place to navigate, the land use, code process, permit process, so that the end goal is that we are producing more affordable housing. So that's the level of thinking, and that's the level of focus that we have when it comes to what can we do to incentivize private sector partners to come to the table, because again, this housing problem or crisis cannot be solved alone with federal dollars or state dollars or local dollars. We need our private sector partners at the table.
Great. Well, thank you. And just one final question regarding some of the demographics and the research. One of the things that was also brought to my attention regarding the demographics is, we talk about the growth of the city and the number of people that are coming, but that in fact the growth is generated primarily from Latino families who already live within the city. I'm glad to show that I'm doing my part to increase the number of Latino families in this community. And then two-part to that is that I also learned that 80% of my population of my district is 35 and younger. And so I guess, are you taking those two demographics into consideration when you're doing your recommendation that it's largely Latino families that already live here, and that we have such a young population? Or at least we do in District 5, but even citywide, I think it's been presented that we actually have a very young city.
Right. We are definitely looking at the demographics of our city. One of our public working group working meetings, we invited Dr. Science from UTSA to provide a presentation on the changes in population, and it was very clear to us, as you've indicated, that San Antonio is largely Latino and also a very young population. So as we think about the importance of making housing information available, and actually this also came up through one of our technical working groups, they were looking at incorporating technological sort of platforms, to be able to connect with younger populations, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just sort of the physical place, but it's also how you make that information available. So we are, definitely considering the demographics, and really at the end of the day, this has been a very locally driven process. It's been about what is happening in our city, what has happened over the last 20 years, where are we now, what do we need to do to course correct and to address the problem before it becomes a larger crisis. And then also understanding maybe how other cities are tackling this issue, but not necessarily just sort of taking sort of what they're doing, but looking at, does it fit does it fit within our city? Is it appropriate for us? And so all that to say is that we think it's important to ground this in the population that we serve, and also to recognize and acknowledge that it's very diverse, it's changing, and it's very young. So we will be incorporating that in the narrative and in the approach to our policy recommendations.
Okay, great. I think that's very important, because even I had an image of, people flooding in from other places, that it wasn't necessarily an organic process, but apparently that's the case.
Great.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I think that was all the questions I had or comments that I had. I think Councilman Courage and the others also touched on the need for more public housing, or, you know, that population that is below the 30%. I think that's an important issue as well. I think y'all touched on that. So, and I think thank you all so much. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. This is really so important and really exciting, I think, as we policymakers, to have some direction from experts like yourself. So thank you all so much. And then, so I know that you're still working through some details, but we look for, did you extend the timeline, or how are we with a formal report?
So next week, on June the 20th, the 5 of us as a task force will be presenting to the council the final recommendations and the implementation plan. And we will then go into finalizing the executive report that currently we're projecting between 30 to 50 pages, and a community impact report that is a smaller piece, you know, to be able to share information with the larger community, and hopefully in a way that's, you know, more understandable. And then by August of this year, we will release the final comprehensive report with all of the attachments and documentation. I think that report will be online because it looks like it's going to be pretty voluminous. And I just wanted to say, Councilwoman, I just again wanted to have an opportunity to thank the city staff, you know, our deputy city manager, Peter Zanoni, and Veronica Soto, our director of neighborhood and housing services, and really their entire team. They have been part of this process from the beginning, and we recognize that, you know, for this to be able to go into effect and be implemented and be successful, it really requires, you know, having the city staff at the table and taking ownership. And I also want to recognize, of course, the mayor's office, Marisa Bono, the chief policy officer, along with Victoria Gonzalez, and many other members of the mayor's team who have also been, of course, lending support and guidance throughout the process. So thank you very much for having us, and we appreciate the feedback and the comments and the ideas that were generated today.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all. That was our only item. We kept it short, so thank you all. Have a great day.